It started with a knock on the driver's window. The billionaire, known for his eccentric habits and over-the-top parties, leaned down and asked a question that would set everything into motion. "You got a kid?" The driver, startled and confused, nodded slowly. He had mentioned his daughter in passing during one of their long drives, not thinking much of it. But clearly, the billionaire had remembered. And now, for reasons that weren't immediately clear, he was inviting the young girl, just 12 years old, to his private poker night. The driver hesitated, unsure whether this was a joke, a test, or something worse. But the billionaire was already smiling, already saying, "Bring her. Let's have some fun." The mansion was a place people only ever saw in magazines or on TV. Gilded chandeliers, walls covered in abstract art that probably cost more than an entire house, and rooms so large they made even adults feel small. The guest list was even more surreal. Hedge fund managers, former senators, CEOs, and celebrities. Everyone wore designer suits and dresses. Everyone held a glass of something expensive. And suddenly, into this world of power and wealth, stepped a girl in a simple outfit and braids, clutching a notebook and looking around with wide eyes. Some laughed. Some whispered. Some just stared. They thought it was a joke. A child, here? To play poker? It had to be part of the billionaire's latest stunt. A social experiment, maybe. Or a bet. One of the guests leaned over to another and said, "What's next? His dog playing blackjack?" It didn't matter to them that this girl had been solving advanced math problems since the age of 7. That she had memorized entire strategy books about probability and decision theory. That she had been watching her father play cards in the garage with friends for years, learning not just the rules but the psychology behind each hand. None of that mattered to people who had already decided who she was based on how she looked and where she came from. The driver sat to the side, visibly tense, watching as his daughter took her seat at the table. The billionaire waved over his dealer and whispered something. Chips were brought out. Real ones. High stakes. More than most families made in a year. But the girl didn't blink. She sat upright, calm, focused. She asked a single question, Texas Hold'em or 5-card draw? A murmur spread around the room. Someone chuckled awkwardly. The billionaire grinned. She was given a seat, right between two men who owned half of downtown property. Cards were dealt. Conversations quieted. The game began. No one expected her to last more than 2 rounds. She was 12 after all. And yet, hand after hand, she made decisions that confused and frustrated the others. She folded when the pot was large and the bluff was obvious. She raised confidently when the odds were in her favor. She didn't fidget. She didn't talk. She didn't fall for bait. Slowly, laughter gave way to silence. Smirks turned to furrowed brows. People began to realize that this wasn't a game to her, not in the way they had assumed. This was a test, and she had studied. From the moment she walked into the room, the weight of dismissal was heavy in the air. It wasn't spoken outright, but it didn't have to be. The glances exchanged between the guests, the half-smiles, the poorly masked chuckles, they all spoke volumes. She was a child. Not just a child, but a black girl from a working-class family, stepping into a domain where pedigree and privilege were expected prerequisites. Her clothes, though neat, didn't scream designer. Her shoes weren't polished leather or glittering heels. She carried no air of entitlement, no practiced charm, no famous last name. To them, she was an oddity, a novelty, maybe even a prop in some strange game the billionaire was playing. The driver, her father, stood awkwardly near the door, unsure if he should stay or wait outside. He was used to being invisible in these spaces, his presence acknowledged only when necessary. But now, his daughter, his brilliant, focused daughter, was at the center of it all, and he could feel the heat of every sideways glance directed their way. He had told her not to worry, that she didn't have to say yes to the invitation, that it was okay to walk away. But she had looked at him and said, without hesitation, "I want to see how good they really are." Still, the room had already decided. Before she even touched a card, she was underestimated. An older man in a sleek gray suit leaned over to the person beside him and whispered something that made them both laugh. Someone else asked if she knew the rules. Another one joked about using candy instead of chips. The billionaire, watching it all from his seat at the head of the table, remained amused, sipping his drink as if orchestrating a private show. No one took the girl seriously. Not yet. Not when they were used to rooms where everyone looked and acted like them, spoke in the same coded language of old money and elite schools. When she sat down at the table, her feet barely touching the floor, one of the players offered her a booster cushion with a smirk. She politely declined. Another asked if she needed help shuffling. Her expression didn't change. She didn't respond with sarcasm or protest. She simply waited, observing, noting who was already showing their cards without even realizing it. They thought she was quiet because she was intimidated, but really, she was calculating, listening, reading the room in ways they never expected. Some of the guests began making bets among themselves, not with chips, but with words. How many hands would she last? Would she cry when she lost? Would the billionaire let her win a round or two for show? These people weren't used to being wrong, especially not about someone they had written off in the first 5 seconds. They carried confidence the way others carry names, inherited and unshakable. To them, the table was more than a game. It was a reflection of their world, their place in it, their belief that intelligence and power came with a suit and a surname. She remained composed. She didn't try to impress them with charm or explanations. She didn't introduce herself with a resume or a list of accomplishments. She had nothing to prove to them, only to herself. But that calmness was exactly what made them uneasy. It clashed with the image they had already painted in their minds. And as the first cards were dealt, she looked down at her hand with the same careful concentration as she had practiced 1,000 times. The first few hands passed with little reaction. Most of the players weren't paying close attention. They still believed this was entertainment, a minor distraction, a momentary amusement for the host's benefit. But as the chips began to move and hands began to fold, a subtle shift in the air began to take place. The girl, quiet and still, wasn't just staying in the game as she was winning. Not every hand, but the ones that mattered. Her choices were deliberate, her timing unnerving. She folded when the pot was bloated with bluffs and raised when she had just enough strength to challenge the table. Her reads were precise. Her face unreadable. Her play style made no noise, but it disrupted everything. At first, they tried to justify it. Maybe she was lucky. Beginners often are, they told themselves. Maybe someone was giving her signs. Maybe the billionaire was tipping her somehow, turning the game into a show for his guests. But none of that explained how she spotted a double bluff from the man who owned 2 casinos, or how she laid down a winning hand without hesitation because she read the tension in the room and knew someone else was desperate to recover their losses. She was not guessing. She was studying body language, hesitation, bet sizing, hand positioning, vocal tone. Everything the others ignored, she observed and logged. The players began to take longer between moves. Their easy confidence was wearing thin. One man tapped the table with his ring fingers, agitated. Another began to ask the dealer to repeat the pot count, double-checking what had been obvious before. They were no longer amused. They were unsettled. This girl, who looked like she belonged at a spelling bee, was dissecting their strategies like she had written the rulebook herself. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. But each time she collected a pot, there was a quiet defiance in her posture, like she had expected this all along. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, watching the room with a satisfied gleam. He wasn't surprised. He had seen something in her from the beginning, something most of the people in the room were just now starting to recognize. Her intelligence wasn't loud or theatrical. It didn't need to be. It radiated from her control, from the small adjustments she made, from the way she never broke her focus, no matter how many eyes were on her. The same people who had made jokes under their breath were now adjusting their strategies, trying to mask their tells, leaning forward with growing concern. But it was too late. She had already seen them clearly. By the 6th hand, a man in his 50s muttered under his breath as she raked in another stack of chips. The woman next to him glanced around the table, visibly unsure of her place in the pecking order. The silence grew thicker. No one was laughing anymore. Even the servers had stopped moving for a moment, sensing the change in mood. A child was dismantling a hierarchy that none of them had ever thought to question. Not by force, not by protest, but by being better, smarter, colder under pressure. Her moves weren't flashy, but they were surgical. And the worst part for the others? She made it look effortless. Every time the cards were dealt, the girl's expression remained calm, but her eyes sharpened. She didn't blink unnecessarily. She didn't fidget. She made each decision as if she had already calculated the outcome 10 moves ahead. Her brain processed risk like a machine. And still, she said almost nothing. The room that had once dismissed her was now revolving around her choices, adjusting to her tempo, reacting to her logic. The child genius wasn't proving a point. She was simply playing her game. The poker table, once just a piece of luxury furniture in the billionaire's mansion, began to take on a different meaning as the game went on. It stopped being about cards and chips and turned into something more, a metaphor for the unspoken rules of power, perception, and control. Around that table sat individuals who were used to winning before the game even started because the system had been designed with them in mind. Their suits, their net worth, their surnames were often more valuable than any hand they held. And yet, none of that helped them now. Not against a girl they hadn't taken seriously, who now held more influence over the pace and energy of the room than any of them. She wasn't playing just for fun, even if that's how it started. The game became her way of speaking in a language they understood: money, logic, dominance, patience. Each bet was a challenge. Each fold was a statement. Every time she raised the pot, she wasn't just making a play. She was confronting years of assumptions. She understood exactly how perception could shape outcomes, and she used it against them. She let them believe she was new, overwhelmed, unsure. She watched them underestimate her, and she let it happen. That was part of her strategy. It was how she gained her edge. As the game progressed, the poker table revealed more than just winners and losers. It revealed how much of power is performance, how much of control is about who is expected to lead, who is assumed to follow, and who is simply overlooked. Her silence forced others to listen more closely. Her calm made others nervous. They had built entire careers on commanding rooms, giving speeches, closing deals, being heard. She didn't need any of that. She had mastery in a quieter form. She didn't chase the spotlight. She let it find her. The girl's approach to the game didn't rely on aggression or flair. She didn't try to bluff her way through or intimidate the others with bravado. She relied on truth, the truth she saw in their eyes, in their movements, in the inconsistencies in their behavior. While the others tried to read her, she was 10 steps ahead, reading the entire room. And in doing so, she shifted the balance. She forced seasoned players to question their instincts, to second-guess their experience. The longer she played, the more apparent it became that she wasn't winning by chance. She was winning by understanding people better than they understood themselves. Every round was another layer peeled back, exposing what people do when they feel cornered, when they're losing ground, when their image is at risk. The table, once a playground for ego, became a stage for revelation. This wasn't just about poker anymore. It was about who society deems worthy of respect and who must earn it tenfold. It was about how quickly brilliance can be dismissed when it doesn't come in the expected packaging. The other players had entered the room confident that they were the smartest people there. Now they weren't so sure. For the girl, poker was never about luck. It was a system of patterns, probabilities, and psychology. She had studied it like a science, but played it like an art. And around her, one by one, the men and women who ruled industries found themselves unsure, hesitant, defensive. Her strategy wasn't about showing dominance. It was about maintaining control. She didn't need to prove she belonged at the table. Her every move made it obvious. As the chips piled in front of her, the table became something more than a game. It became a quiet revolution. It didn't take long for the story to leak beyond the walls of the billionaire's mansion. At first, it spread in hushed tones among the guests themselves, those who couldn't quite believe what they had witnessed, yet couldn't stop talking about it either. A child, black and unknown, sitting in a room full of titans and outplaying them with nothing but intellect and nerve. Some told the story like it was a curious anecdote. Others shared it with visible discomfort, knowing it challenged the narrative they'd built around success, talent, and pedigree. Soon, a few snapshots from the evening, taken discreetly by attendees, circulated online, and the internet did what it always does. It turned the story into a spark. Headlines popped up almost overnight. 12-year-old outsmarts millionaires at private poker game. Child genius flips the script in a room full of elites. Who was the girl that left billionaires speechless? Media outlets latched onto the story like it was a modern-day fairy tale, but the truth behind it ran much deeper. For some, it was heartwarming, a feel-good example of untapped potential. For others, it was a disruption, because it questioned who we expect brilliance to look like and where we expect it to come from. Talk shows debated it. Journalists dug into her background. Everyone wanted to know how a girl with no formal poker training had walked into a game meant for the world's elite and left them shaken. People speculated wildly. Was she a prodigy raised in secret? Had the billionaire trained her? Was it a setup? But those who knew her understood that none of this was a trick or a fluke. She was simply gifted, not just in math or logic, but in perception, restraint, and strategy, skills that are rarely credited unless they come with a diploma or a title. The conversations that followed weren't just about poker. They reached into classrooms, boardrooms, and neighborhoods. Teachers began using her story to talk about bias, about the danger of assuming potential based on appearance. Parents brought her up at dinner tables, asking why a child like that hadn't been discovered earlier. Educators questioned the systems in place that so often overlook exceptional kids because they don't speak, look, or act the way genius is traditionally packaged. Her story became a mirror, forcing institutions to confront the fact that brilliance often exists in silence, waiting for a chance to be seen. What began as an isolated moment inside a mansion quickly evolved into something bigger. Commentators and activists started connecting the dots, using her story as an example of how opportunity is often limited not by talent but by access. What if she hadn't been invited? What if her father hadn't worked for the billionaire? What if she had never gotten the chance to sit at that table? Those questions lingered beneath every news article and viral post, challenging the comfortable myth that merit always rises to the top on its own. Her victory wasn't loud. There was no celebration, no fireworks, no trophies. But the ripple effect it caused was undeniable. In online forums, aspiring young minds, especially girls of color, saw someone who looked like them doing something no one thought she could. She became a symbol of what happens when raw talent is finally given a platform. She didn't ask for recognition, yet it came. Not because she chased it, but because her quiet excellence made it impossible to ignore. Even the billionaire, who had orchestrated the night with a mixture of curiosity and amusement, found himself fielding questions from reporters and peers alike. What made him invite her? Had he known what she was capable of? His answers were vague, sometimes evasive. But behind closed doors, many wondered whether he had seen something in her that no one else had thought to look for. As the story of the girl at the poker table continued to spread, it began to take on a life of its own, sparking conversations far beyond the original event. People were fascinated, inspired, and in many cases, unsettled. The image of a young black girl calmly outplaying billionaires became a cultural flashpoint, not just for what it said about her intelligence, but for what it revealed about the systems that had overlooked her in the first place. Her victory forced a reckoning, not just in the world of poker, but in society at large. It posed a question that refused to be ignored. How many other prodigies had been dismissed simply because they didn't fit the mold of what genius is supposed to look like? She hadn't come to the table to make a statement about race or class or gender. She had come because she was invited and because she was ready. But her presence became all of those things and more. Her win wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a confrontation with the quiet, pervasive assumptions that shape opportunity. People began asking themselves uncomfortable questions. Why had the other players assumed she didn't belong? Why did her victory feel so shocking, so out of place? The truth was, it shouldn't have. But it did. Because the narrative of excellence had for too long been reserved for a select few, schools began reaching out to her family. Scholarships appeared. Talent scouts who had ignored her community before were now eager to claim credit. People who once questioned her ability now called her gifted, brilliant, extraordinary. But those who had watched her grow knew that none of this was new. She had always been this sharp, this disciplined, this intuitive. The difference now was that someone important had seen her. The difference now was the room she'd been allowed to enter in community centers and online spaces. Young people looked to her not just as a success story, but as a symbol of what could happen if the gatekeepers finally stepped aside. Her win had cracked open a door, if only for a moment, and the light that spilled through revealed a landscape of untapped brilliance that had been hidden in plain sight. People began to share their own stories of being underestimated, overlooked, dismissed. The poker table had become more than a game board. It was now a metaphor for the wider world, where the stakes were even higher, and the rules were rarely fair. She didn't ask to become a movement. But the moment asked it of her anyway. Interviews followed, and with them, opinions from every corner. Some praised her humility. Others questioned whether she was being used. Debates raged over whether it was right to frame her as a prodigy or a symbol. But through it all, her calm never wavered. She kept showing up, not to prove anything, but because she loved the game, the math, the challenge. And in that simple act of showing up, she gave others permission to do the same. The billionaire who had invited her remained a mystery in all of this. Some believed he had been trying to make a point about hidden talent. Others thought he simply enjoyed chaos. Whatever his reason, he had unintentionally pulled back the curtain on a larger truth, that access is power, and power often determines whose intelligence gets seen and whose goes unnoticed. His mansion, once a symbol of exclusivity, had become the unlikely setting for a quiet revolution, one that began with a girl, a deck of cards, and a room full of people who didn't see her coming in the end. It wasn't the chips or the hands she played that people remembered most. It was the silence she created when she played. The kind of silence that comes when a room built on certainty is suddenly made uncertain. The kind of silence that forces people to sit with their assumptions, to question what they think they know about genius, about worth, about who belongs at the table too.